Today's visual novel is Komyu, Black Dragon in a Gentle Kingdom. Komyu is the tale of 5 strangers who have been called upon by a mysterious entity only known to the masses as Girl A, and have been gifted with a special power upon their meeting. This power allows them to summon a mystic beast known in this universe as avatars. This is also the Black Dragon mentioned in the subtitle of the game. Unfortunately, there is a heavy consequence to using this power. If the avatar is killed, then all the members controlling it will also die in response, which wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that there exist other teams, or Komyus as this game likes to describe them, that also control avatars of their own and are more than willing to destroy the main character's avatar for their own gain. Thus begins a new life for this team of strangers as they fight for both survival and for the sake of their own ideals. Essentially, Komyu is very similar to the likes of Fate Stay Night and Rewrite in terms of its overall tone and execution, so fans of those two games will likely find the most enjoyment out of Komyu. Komyu, much like Fate Stay Night, might sound like more of a survival visual novel than anything, as the avatars play a similar role to servants, though they have no real personality, but it's actually fairly tame in this regard. This is partly due to the game's emphasis more so on its own philosophy of the vanity of ideals, morals, and values. It's essentially the exact same set of messages and questions that Swansong tried to tackle, and there are several parallels you can find between the two works in fact. It's handled slightly differently and there is slightly different questions, but it's the same basic idea. In a way, its cynical nature might be a little off-putting for some audience members, but it does allow for some interesting dilemmas to be tackled amongst the characters, and it is the main strength the story has to offer. As all the characters live by different standards, and because of this, they don't always blend well together, and it's a source of much conflict because of this. Though it's not all dark, as it does combine itself with plenty of lighthearted comedic moments, even during the more serious times the game has to offer, like most visual novels really, so fear not, even though I say it's somewhat similar to Swansong, it never gets that dark and depressing. As far as the comedy goes, it does serve to give the group of characters some semblance of chemistry with each other. However, the jokes are repeated a bit too often for my taste, and honestly felt like they were overly relied on throughout the course of the game. You can try and count how many times Kagome belittles Akihito, or someone comments on how flat-chested Benio is, for example. The group dynamic of the characters in general really doesn't change too much after the common route in particular, and I really feel like more development needed to be given to them as a group as a whole. Still, I will say as a positive, is the group themselves kind of give off this casual vibe, despite the circumstances the characters find themselves in, and honestly, I can see many readers enjoying the game for that alone. As far as the characters themselves, it's really a mixed bag. I do think a large part of the enjoyment really hinges on if you can tolerate Akihito as a character. Akihito suffered a trauma from a very young age with his mother being killed right in front of him. There's more details to this that are revealed throughout the game, of course. As such, he gains a soft spot to helping women and usually will take ridiculous actions throughout the game to help them in response. Imagine basically how Shiro would act at Fate Stay Night, if you will. Also, because of this trauma, it leads him to have a strong moral conflict going on for most of the game, with his ideals that really conflict with one another and how other people's ideals will be interjected onto him. This leads to him preaching his view of life several times throughout the game, which usually comes down to the message of there's several ways you can look at things, it just depends on your perspective. He does this so often that personally I found his inner monologue borderline obnoxious to read after a while. And really, he's just waffles the whole game. That's really all he does. He can't really make up his mind. It's just irritating. At the very least, he does come across as very human and flawed, but I can't say that was enough to save the writing of his character. The rest of the cast I will cover briefly in the spoiler territory of this review, not every character of course, because there's really no reason to, where I will go over the individual routes, but the problem is pretty consistent with all of them. While I would say all of them have interesting elements that make up their character, many of them do not feel very well explored and come across very lacking in development. As such, it was difficult for me to really care about anyone in the cast except for perhaps Benio and Mayuki, and even then I don't feel like either character was done as much justice as they should have been done. The bigger problem is several of the antagonists the main characters fight against throughout the story are incredibly shallow villain of the week. I mean, I could handle them being shallow, but they don't even have much personality, so it makes the majority of the fights really boring except for one guy. Literally one antagonist who is okay to fight against, I guess, if you want to even call him an antagonist. To go further into the fights, I have to say this game has some of the weakest in the visual novel medium. Not that it's a great medium for fights in the first place. The problem, other than what it was stated previously with shallow antagonists, is that they simply go on too long, and there simply isn't much strategy to them. Which is strange, because at the start of the story, we are introduced to the concept of classes that the connectors, or the individual teammates, of the avatars can fall into. For example, a mage can increase the movement of an avatar, while a priest dictates defense of an avatar. However, the only team where you're really shown what the classes are doing at any point in time is the main character's side of things, and never the opponent's. And the opponent, it shows you, but it only shows you what the leader is doing. A shame, because having group dynamics of two teams play a part could have led to some interesting strategies and taking place, and interesting, probably, psychology taking place. But instead, the battles come across very cut and dry, very simple. And also, the strategy really comes down, rather than those classes, it's really just as simple as how many connectors are available at the time, because having less makes the avatar weaker and harder to control. This might take place because the main character's party might be ambushed when they are not all together at the same time, which at least does lead to a few interesting situations where the main party has to fight with a handicapped avatar. Unfortunately, most fights are uninteresting simply because they go on too long, and what I said before. And watching Babylon bounce up and down as it charges towards something is really funny to watch. I won't go into why I think fight scenes in visual novel are typically bland, but I will say that they should not even attempt to make static sprites give the hint that they are moving around, because it just always looks silly. In the end, the fights are the low point of the game, and really only 2 fights with the exact same person are worth any attention. You're pretty much gonna probably forget most of the fights by the time you're done with the game. Story-wise, the game is separated into a common route, of course, with 5 heroine routes that follow it. The first 4 need to be played to unlock the 5th one. Normally, this would imply they all build onto the true route, but this isn't really the case in this game, as I'll explain in more detail later. To cut things short, it's unnecessary to read either Mayuki and especially Ayaya's route, as they add nothing to the core of the story. Even Hisoka's route can be skipped, as the ground that it covers is mostly reintroduced in the final route. And in fact, Benio's route could potentially be skipped for the same reason, because most of the ground it covers is also reintroduced in the final route. That being said, it's not like the story is the highlight of the game anyway, as there really isn't much of one in the first place. It takes far too long for the core story of the game to actually take place. Even when it does, it's both predictable and poorly executed in my eyes. And even when it does, it's executed both predictably and poorly in my eyes. The game more focuses on the world building and the background information about the city and the Komyu societies that inhabit it than any real plot for the most of the game, which I will say is decently done world building. The concept of the Gentle Kingdom being merciful to all those in it isn't really a new concept. As I said, this is basically what Swan Song does, but does add to the characters' individual dilemmas and way of being sufficiently enough. In the end, a big problem with the game is the main character's party stay far too much in the background of things rather than being actively engaged on most of the happenings within the plot for the majority of the game. As a result, there really isn't much to look forward to unless there's a woman in trouble that Akihito needs to help, which in turn makes the game kind of static and boring. And actually, the strongest part of this game was actually the initial common route, while the heroine routes were all lacking and pretty weak if you ask me. Musically, the game is quite a bit better than average. The opening song in particular is very catchy, and honestly I think I liked it more than I liked the actual game. But the rest of the tracks are also pretty high quality in themselves as well, so you might want to listen to it outside of the game on occasion. I won't say it's too impressive or memorable, but it definitely gets the job done. The artwork is also very satisfying and pretty consistent, unlike a lot of visual novels I've read lately, so it looks good. And the avatars are really nice. They're creative and pretty well detailed. The only problem with them is the designs are repeated too often, so you'll see the same sprite over and over again, just with a different palette swap, kind of like an RPG, which I guess makes sense with the class system, so maybe that was part of the point and what it wanted to tackle with those. But regardless, art-wise, musically-wise, I don't think it's going to disappoint anyone. Overall, Komyu is something I would describe as something that had a lot of initial potential, but didn't really live up to it. As such, I can't really recommend it unless you are a big fan of shonen visual novels and need another one to fill the void. Now I'm gonna go venture into spoiler territory now to just give my thoughts on all the routes. If you haven't read the game, don't go past here. Unless you're just curious, of course, in which case feel free. To start with the common route, I really did feel this was a really enjoyable way to introduce the setting and all the characters in it. I never felt like the pacing was too slow or any individual scene was dragged out for too long. Plus the struggle of having Benio and Akihito come to terms with having to kill someone else for the sake of their own ideals and survival was a great way to get the initial development with their group going along. It's just a shame that this feels like the most development that they actually get as a group, or at the very least the most genuine development. However, the true highlight of the common route is all the conversational scenes Akihito has with Gasai. Gasai in general is the best written character in the game, as his dialogue, voice acting, and general chemistry with Akihito, as he and Akihito have more chemistry than any pair of characters in the game, and just his overall way of conveying himself is just excellent. The end of the common route where he asked Akihito to join his side only left me further excited for what this game had in store for his character. However, little did I know at this point that Gasai really is only a side character in the grand scheme of things. He's not really a main antagonist role. This is one of the many things that makes the heroine routes disappointing compared to the common route, as he's hardly a part of the rest of the game, and his role is definitely underused. I can't imagine this was the actual intended use for his character, as all the build-up he got in the common route, and especially the end of it, seemed to suggest otherwise. Also, I'm just going to say, as a personal opinion, that Akihito never choosing to join his side was a huge bummer, as it easily would have been more interesting than what we got in any of the other routes. The closest we get to Akihito being an anti-hero was in Hisoka's route. Regardless, that's not a complaint for the common route itself, which was overall very well done and much stronger than most visual novels, so they really did a bang-up job with this common route, if you ask me, and it's a great introduction to the game. Benio, the first route that you were required to play, and you are given no option to choose otherwise. As you can imagine, this is really just an introductory route, say like Katori's route in Rewrite, to the story, which isn't much of a story. So it's kind of redundant to actually have an introductory route, but whatever. Benio as a character is actually quite nice. Her personality is easily likable, her design is great, and her voice actress does an absolutely lovely job of bringing her to life. Honestly, she would be my favorite heroine. However, this route doesn't do her much justice, pardon the pun. Her central conflict is that she wants to use the group's avatar to fight for justice. However, not only do the members in her Komyu not really support this idea and would rather not risk their lives for this endeavor, but the game tackles the issue that her ideal is rather impractical in the real world. The shades of gray of society and the ever-changing nature of it really makes it difficult for her ideal to ever come to realization. This would be interesting, indeed, if the route had chosen to focus on her at all. Instead, this route tries to tackle a lot of things going on in the Komyu world, and really just feels like a string of events that blend together without much focus on anything. This leads to not only Benio's character come across as really flat, actually, by the end of things, it also makes her relationship with Akihito feel quite forced and shallow. One funny scene in this route is that Akihito is actually hanging out with Rondo for intervals in it as well, who is otherwise a mostly insignificant side character, and he casually has sex with her even when he's messing around with Benio. It's another aspect that just shows how much of a clown Akihito is, if I want to put it like the game does. Speaking of which, women really do fall in love with him very easily. I get this is a harem game, but it felt like it wasn't even trying to make a single relationship he has believable other than with Mayuki. Now, fortunately, this route also involves Gasai in the ending, even though he is otherwise barely a part of the route. This feels almost random and has no real build-up to it. But thankfully, because it's Gasai, the fight is probably the best part of the whole game. Like, no, seriously, it's the best part of the entire game. I do quite like how it played out in an unpredictable fashion, though, with Akihito not really being able to beat Gasai during this fight, and even the use of Benio was used quite well, with her coming to terms with the answer she was looking for, regardless of the lack of focus on her, and it really was just to convey a message to Gasai, which during the fight he even loses sight of himself, which was also quite interesting. Still, it got me worried that he wouldn't play a big role in the rest of the game if he's already been given a final fight in this introductory route. And that's exactly what happens. All in all, it's an underwhelming route, even for an introduction. Nothing is given much development, nothing is given much focus, and barely anything exciting happens until the end. So, it's boring. Mayuki. Mayuki's route has a very simple problem. It's a route from a character game, not a story-oriented visual novel, which makes it jarring for just about anyone who reads it, because if they wanted to read a Karage route, they would just read a Karage. Instead of focusing on the Komyu setting, it focuses on Mayuki, her lifestyle, and her relationship with Akihito. I can imagine a good deal of readers didn't care for this route simply due to this fact. However, if I judge it from purely a storytelling perspective and a Karage perspective, if I want to be as fair to it as possible, it's not too bad. In fact, kill me for this, but I'd argue it's the strongest written route in terms of storytelling. The reason is pretty simple. It's the only route that truly dedicates itself to focusing on the development of the heroine in question, and as such, she gets more than anyone in the game, really. And it's consistent development. It happens throughout the route, both in small ways and in large ways. So it's nice to see her ever-changing nature throughout this route, even if it might not be easily apparent. Because of this, her relationship with Akihito also comes across a lot more genuine and not pushed on the player just to have an excuse for a romance in the game. Plus, even though it doesn't focus on the Komyu setting much, it is still used towards the end, and I feel like it's applied in a fairly genuine manner, and it does have pretty good build-up leading up to it, which is more than I can say about any other route. The comedy is also much better in the route, if you ask me, and there are a lot of great funny scenes in it, like the scene where they're recording voice acting, that scene's hilarious. And funny enough, because it's clear this route is written by a different writer, Akito's repetitive narration, where he's just waffling all the time, drops almost entirely, and he honestly just comes across as a completely different character. While inconsistent, I have to say that Akito was a lot more endearing in this route because of this, which only helped me like it more. The only issue I have with this route, other than the obvious, is that the antagonist K is once again a completely dull and shallow villain, like every villain besides Gasai, and I would have preferred it if no real villain was a part of this route. Otherwise, it's simple, but effective in its approach. It simply just doesn't have any place in this game. I really don't even need to talk about this route, because it is a joke of a route. It feels even more out of place than Mayuki's, funny enough. I mean, Ayaya is not even a part of their Komyu, or really a part of the setting. I guess you could argue that it's to give a normal person's view on all of this, but she's really not a part of this, and she is not a normal person. She's a typical anime girl, so yeah, it's dumb. I guess you could say, since she's placed 4th in the recommended route order in the game, that it was to lighten things up before the true route, but still, it should not be in the game. At all. The only benefit to this route is it's quite short, so at least it doesn't overstay its welcome for too long, but it does overstay its welcome regardless. It's quite funny how easily Akihito seems to get over his issues in this route too, which makes him seem even more shallow in hindsight. Regardless, I don't think a single person should waste their time with it because it has nothing worth reading in it, and even from a Karage standpoint, it's just bad. Just download a save and move on. Just do that. Unless you really don't care and, you'll read every route regardless and you don't care, then fine, have fun with it. Hisoka. This route is also quite jarring in many ways. The heroine in question isn't even introduced in the game at all until you're done with Benio's route, nor is she in any route beside the true route, and this one, obviously. A very strange decision to be making in the construction of the story, but I can roll with it as long as she can possibly make up the difference with lots of development and lots of exposition on her character. Unfortunately, this route is probably the weakest story-oriented route I've ever read. It does just about everything wrong it can do wrong. For one, it takes forever to get rolling. Akihito's group spends a lot of time in this underground tournament place, which really doesn't go anywhere for a long time, and it's just freaking boring. The main issue, though, is that even though this is a Hisoka route, she's hardly in it at all. I swear, if this route was, say, 4 to 5 hours long, then she is only in it for the equivalent of like 30 minutes, at most. She's in the game less than the boob nurse chick, who I can't even remember the name of. So, yeah. A shame, really, because her character concept honestly doesn't seem too bad, and I didn't mind her way of conveying herself, as it seemed somewhat interesting, and her chemistry with Akihito felt like it could have gone somewhere, honestly. It was just hard to care, really. Also, as you can imagine, her romance with Akihito is terribly forced and rushed and completely unbelievable. And not only is it unbelievable from a romantic perspective, but Akihito willing to do so much for this character to the point where he doesn't mind going against his friend's wishes for her. It's just, quite honestly, a ridiculous spectacle to partake in, as this is the only route where Akihito acts like an anti-hero, which means he gets the most interesting technical development in this route, but nothing in the route really warrants why he should act like this. It's this point that I felt like the author was almost being overly reliant on the past trauma of Akihito to act the way he does, and he didn't want to put any effort to develop him properly so we could actually believe why he's acting the way he does. Also, the excuse that Akihito and Hisoka are essentially the same kind of person, I don't think works very well either as a reason on why they are so instantly attached to each other. Even without issues with Hisoka, there's a lot of other things poorly done with this route. For example, there's actually a somewhat interesting conflict between Benio and Rondo Rondo on Rondo Rondo being blinded by revenge. As such, they participate in a match with Rondo Rondo, and Rondo Rondo loses as a consequence. And this leads to Rondo Rondo breaking as a person, because she lost. The reason is sort of expanded on in the true route, but it just seems so overly dramatic for me to really buy it. That's not the end of it, though, as her best friend in her Komyu is actually possessive of her to a yandere degree and ends up stabbing Benio for breaking her best friend. This is not foreshadowed at all. The reason it was done is pretty apparent. Because of this, Benio is taken out of the route entirely for the rest of it. Following that, Mayuki is also taken out because her parents found out she was going out too late and put her under house arrest. And then following that, Mizuzawa is also taken out because a mysterious group attacked him. This leaves Akihito's avatar severely handicapped as a response, as the only ones left are him and Haru. As such, the main reason all of this was done is simply to raise the tension and make it so Akihito's circumstances and the ability to help Hisoka were growing more and more helpless. Which, in theory, might be a good idea, but the execution is too contrived, and it was hard for me to take it seriously as a result. There is one moment in this route that was pretty effective, though, to give it some credit. At one point, you find out that Yoshimori, a girl that Akihito helped earlier in the common route, is involved with a Komyu that is participating in the battle arena as well. This leaves Akihito conflicted because he knows there's not a lot he can really do for her because it's something she decided on her own. As such, when he watches the battle between her Komyu and the king of the arena, I can't remember the avatar's name, I'm sorry. It's actually a pretty tense and fair regardless. Usually, matches that aren't the main character's team fighting the opposing team are a little more tense because the outcome might be a little less predictable, although even though this outcome is pretty predictable, I still think a lot of the times that will be a lot more tense just because it's simply because most of the time you know the main character is gonna overcome, but when a character is not a main character is fighting an antagonist, you're not as quite sure what's gonna happen. And this is an example of how genuine tension is created and works, because it felt completely natural. However, all is not well. While the scene where her Komyu is killed is pretty effective, the aftermath basically ruins the mood the scene set. This is because afterward, Akihito encounters Tori and learns that she is responsible for pushing Yoshimori's Komyu into fighting the king of the arena. This pisses off Akihito so much that he decides to rape her. Yeah, okay, it's not really rape, because after the sex scene you realize she was just letting him do it, and it's played off as a joke, because that's real funny. Regardless, this might be the most tasteless scene I've seen maybe ever in a visual novel. Not only is it not funny, but it completely ruins any sort of feeling I could have had for the previous death scene that I was exposed to. Also, Akihito acts completely out of character, as he has a soft spot for women, so it's unthinkable that this would ever tempt him to rape a woman. Sorry to go on a tangent about this, but quite honestly, this might be the worst thing I've ever seen in a visual novel do in a story game. Also, before we move on, let's talk about Tori. Why is she in this game again? She's a girl with unexplained powers that also wasn't introduced until after Benio's route, and also isn't in any other route but this route and the true route. And she really doesn't play much of a role in the game other than to spout the occasional nonsense to Akihito. Though I'm also fairly certain she has more screen time than Hisoka, ironically. My guess is she really was just an excuse to have another character for Akihito to have sex with in the end. To end this off, I'll briefly touch on Hisoka's conflict. She and her family were involved in the so-called terrorist attacks several years ago, which were obviously Avatar attacks, if anyone couldn't guess this. This basically ruined her entire life, and she simply doesn't know the purpose of her life anymore. Basically, she's like a dog who's looking for a place to die, much like Akihito in some ways. This is why she involves herself in the battle arena and with the other man in her Komyu, as she's just waiting for someone to kill her. So the whole struggle of the route is Akihito trying to help someone who no longer has the will to live. I'll be honest in saying, I thought this was probably the most interesting thing to tackle in the game, that could have been tackled at least. But it also shows you that without proper execution or development, it's all kind of pointless, and even a simple route like Mayuki's can be far superior as a result. All in all, it's just a bad route. A really, really bad route. Kagome, the so-called true route of the game, if you really want to even call it that. Basically, this route serves the purpose of trying to expand and cover every single character in the game. Of course, being called Kagome's route, you would think it would be primarily about Kagome. But not really. That's right, it's got the same problem as Benio's route, except to an even greater degree, because even more things try to get covered during it, so Kagome gets even less screen time and development than Benio does. This leads to, once again, a complete lack of focus on anything really going on in it, and it really just feels like a string of events that are somehow pulled together. It sort of starts out with the Hisoka problem, again, which really makes me question why she even had a route if they were just going to cover the exact same problem one more time. Except, of course, this time things don't end well for her. I'm pretty sure the writers hated her character by this point. Very early on, her avatar goes berserk, and Akihito, Gasai, Tori, and Rondo try to stop her. Akihito is of course very conflicted once again about putting her down and wants to save her, but she's pretty much beyond saving in this route. Because of Akihito's reluctance to kill her, the legendary Sting that has popped up before has to step in and kill her avatar instead. You then learn that this overpowered avatar is obviously controlled by Kagome, because really, there was any question on who is controlling it. This comes out as a major shock to the main party, of course, and they then learn that some organization has been watching everything and blah blah blah, none of it really matters. You might say I'm basically overlooking this part, but they don't expand on this organization whatsoever, nor do they expand on Ayaya's uncle whatsoever, so there's no point in giving it any attention, because it's pointless. I did enjoy Ayaya's uncle coming out and trying to explain things to the audience, because he's played by a very amusing voice actor, but since none of it's very well expanded upon, it's hard to really care. All that really matters from this segment is the party realizes that Kagome's avatar is responsible for a large chunk of the incident that was covered up as a terrorist attack several years prior. This leads the main party to have a high amount of animosity toward her, as people they knew were involved in that incident. Okay, it's probably primarily just Mizusawa and Benio and Mayuki are just kind of confused, and Haru doesn't really care, because Haru doesn't really care about anything. Akihito is, of course, against alienating her, but the rest of the party is unsure, and they would really like nothing to do with her, and Mizusawa wants to take revenge on her. Because of this, Akihito and Mizusawa engage in a comical fight, and the Komyu breaks up for a very brief interval, which of course you know they're just going to get right back together shortly after for no particular reason. So the main reason this is done is to give Akihito and Kagome some one-on-one time, quite honestly. Akihito encounters Kagome, and she explains her circumstances to Akihito, which might otherwise have been really interesting, but they are only told to you rather than conveyed to you. And it's here where I'm going to discuss an ongoing problem with this game, and especially here. Several of the characters in this game have already gone through a period of time where they have received a large amount of development. For example, Akihito, when he brings himself to murder the person who murders his mother, and then as a response, the person he murders' sister commits suicide because he murdered her brother. This would have been a very interesting thing to really dive into deeply and show the readers his psychological development through all this, rather than simply telling us through exposition and info dumps. And this is why games like Ryuu, the characters are so much easier to sympathize with, because the majority of their development of what made them who they are took place in the past, and it is directly shown in the audience and you're put in their shoes. Komyu doesn't do this. It just info dumps in the most unengaging way possible. Now granted, I'm not saying flashbacks are always necessary. For example, Okabe and Battler from their respective games aren't given flashbacks really, however they develop consistently throughout the course of the game to make up for this, and they develop in interesting ways. In this game, the majority of the characters only receive rather minor development, and only until very late in the game for some of them, and some characters receive zero development, like Haru. Also, even when they do develop, it's clearly not as interesting as what the past could have shown for us. This is the case with basically all the characters outside of, say, Benio and Mayuki, because most of the character development occurs in the game, and what happens in the past isn't really what would be interesting. It made me almost alienated from the cast, and honestly, it was hard to care about the characters as a result. Especially in the case of Kagome, because her past is very interesting in concept. Her Komyu betrays her in the past, she has to kill a ton of avatars to survive, and as a consequence of killing so many avatars, she basically has Hisoka's problem of having a ridiculously strong avatar that could make her go berserk at any given moment. This leads to her having to not only distance herself from most people, but also distance herself from any regrets of killing all the people she did, as doing so would probably break her as a person. If this sounds interesting, it might be, but like said, the game doesn't convey it in a way where I could care or be invested in it. At best, it's an okay idea, but it's not enough to make her a good character by itself. In fact, I found her character to be quite dull in general. Well, most of the characters are, so I guess it's not just her problem. This wouldn't be such a problem, I wouldn't complain about it if the story was engaging or well-paced, like say Phoenix Wright or Danganronpa, but it certainly has slowed down to a crawl by this point, and the plot just isn't that involving. The only other way it could have been saved is by having a great atmosphere, like Sayanotar Forest, but it certainly doesn't have that either. So very much like Akito's Bishop class, it kinda tries to do a little bit of everything, I wanna say, but it doesn't do anything particularly well, and some things it does pretty poorly. So, really this game is failing on all levels to be compelling, at least for me. Of course, after this, Akihito pretty easily convinces her to stay with him, and then they basically become lovers afterwards. Saying this romance is rushed is an understatement, but I guess this route has other things to worry about, and it just wants to hurry and gets things over with. Very shortly after, his Komyu basically gets back together because they learn it wasn't a big deal in the first place, though Mizusawa is still acting like a typical tsundere about it. So yeah, all of that infighting fighting was really just cheap drama. They then learn that Rondo is going after Gasai to take revenge on him because he is the reason her brother got killed. So of course Akihito has to go help once again just because he can't let a lady down. Rondo's backstory also seems a bit crazy to not really be expanded upon either. Apparently, she was so mad about her brother's deaths, she started killing other Komyus to power up her avatar so she could actually take the revenge. She only wanted to target other teams that were using the power for greed, but accidentally manages to kill an innocent one. This basically is the reason for her fragile heart that you were introduced to in Benio's route and Hisoka's route. Now granted, if the story had actually chose to dive into the past completely, then once again, perhaps Rondo could have been a decent character. They do not, and as such it's hard to care about her, and her actions seem overly unreasonable. Perhaps if we had known about how much her brother really meant to her, then it would have been easy to sympathize with her character. However, even when she's fighting Gasai and is about to get killed, I really couldn't care. I could care less about Rondo. She's really not much of anything. You could take her out of the game for the most part, and it wouldn't change anything. Of course, Akihito saves her from Gasai, and they engage in the only other decent fight in the story. Granted, this is their final conflict, so them engaging each other in battle for such shallow reasons is more than a bit anticlimactic. The fight itself has some clever moments from Gasai, like him attacking Akihito constantly to get a Kagome to defend him because he can't actually beat Sting in a straightforward fashion. Of course, there's also some Deus Ex Machina of Babylon and Sting combining or whatever, and they end up wounding Gasai as a result to bring themselves to victory. I won't make a big deal of that Deus Ex Machina because really I just couldn't care about this fight. It just felt like it kinda happened. Much like most of the events in this route, they just kind of happened, and one thing led to another. Of course, the end result is, while Gasai is running away with Yoriko, he gets himself killed by sacrificing himself for her sake. Now, at one end of the spectrum, this is actually a fairly powerful parting, and is easily the best scene in the whole route. At the other end, this is a really anticlimactic way to end his character. Especially since we really never got to see him do much of anything at all. Regardless, I at least cared to some degree, and it did inhibit some emotion from me, and I expect it will do the same for other readers. However, this game never fails to disappoint by this point. They choose to follow up this very emotional moment with a scene where Yoriko and Akihito have sex. Granted, you could say she might be doing this to punish herself, or she might be doing this to comfort herself from her loss, or both even. Regardless, it's placed at such an inappropriate moment that it's just really in terrible taste. Am I supposed to be fapping to this? If I wasn't, I would assume they would just imply the sex scene rather than show the full deal. So while not as bad as the Tori sex scene, it's still very, very bad, and ruins the established emotion I felt earlier. Not to mention, Akihito is technically going out with Kagome at this time, but I guess he's just a loose guy all the way to the end and never will care about any of that. Actually, I guess according to the ending, you can imply he actually has a full-blown harem. I'll also include Mizuzawa in that because I truly believe they're gay for each other. And I really doubt all those girls following him at the end aren't messing around with him, especially with how much of an arrow-gay protagonist he is and how loose he is. And I'll just take the time to mention, I felt like the majority of the sex scenes felt pretty inappropriately placed, or just poorly placed. Even more so than your standard arrow-gay. Anyway, after a while, there's still the crazy Komyu attacks still going on in the city. After a while, this is what got Gasai killed. And because of this, at one point Kagome has to use her avatar once again to protect her allies, and this time she finally does go berserk like Hisoka did prior. So of course, once Akihito is committed to saving her from this, even though the chances of saving her from her berserk status are exponentially lower than Hisoka, which of course means she'll definitely get saved. Of course, the team tries to talk sense into his nonsense, but give up and go along with it, because why not? So while they're engaging in their plan to save her, Kagome is fighting against an inner struggle inside her mind. It's where she encounters Girl A, who basically tells her that if she wants to free herself, that she'll have to take down the ever so many power level points of the monster she beats inside her mind, or something like that. It sounds more convoluted than it really is. Just think of it like Persona 4 if you've ever played that. Funny thing that happens during this is how many times the author states how big her power level is in the form of a numerical value. He must say this number like at least 30 times before the end of the game. Like, I understand he wants to say how big of a deal her power level is and how not easy it would be to overcome it, but he's just getting obnoxious with this. Actually, the game in general by this point has been using a lot of repetitive elements, so I'm not really surprised by this point, though. While fighting, Kagome proceeds to yell "sting" a lot. No, really, that's all she really does. And as she fights through the hordes of monsters, trying not to be overwhelmed by the insane numbers or her sense of guilt by all the lives she's taken, it's then that the author once again brings Hisoka up to face Kagome, or so it seems. It's very strange how much the author seems to really want to try and make this character relevant, but it just doesn't work because she simply doesn't have the screen time to warrant it. Though to this moment's credit, I think it could have actually been a very good moment. Hisoka is basically what would be Kagome's guilt incarnate, as she's a big reason her life got ruined. Plus, she's just recently killed her, and because of her heart growing a bit softer because of her recent interaction with her teammates and Akihito, it makes it a tad more difficult this time. This honestly should have been a much more meaningful scene than it actually felt like. However, Hisoka ends up helping Kagome because she doesn't want Akihito to be sad. I'd just like to mention that Hisoka and Akihito probably have less than 5 minutes of interaction with each other in this route. He sheltered her from the rain, and that's about it. I don't think they interacted beyond that. Once again, it's a moment that really should have worked, and I really like the idea. Such a shame that I felt absolutely nothing from it. So yeah, while this is going on, Akihito pins Kagome and starts headbutting her to try and wake her up from her berserk status. And yeah, shonen shenanigans. What can I say? Just roll with it. Basically, Akihito and Kagome toward the end of this route finally choose to stop dwelling on their trauma so much and just focus on living. However, at this moment, everyone's energy reserves are basically used up for trying to subdue Kagome and her avatar. Consequently, the organization mentioned earlier has surrounded them in order to finish them off. And everything just looks so hopeless. However, the heroes, of course, don't seem to mind this and just proceed to leave the place regardless of the circumstances. And then they live. Shonen shenanigans, what can I say? It just wants to make sure you know the characters are real cool. Afterwards, you're shown a bit of a time skip where all the characters, including Rondo, and Yoriko, accompany each other to continue to fight crime while they avoid the system or organization. And Akihito basically becomes the Batman, I guess you could say. You might see this as Akihito going out with Kagome, but I'm pretty sure, like stated earlier, this is an implied harem ending, which really, that makes sense because of how much of a player Akihito was during the game. And yeah, quite honestly, it doesn't really feel like an actual ending to the story, and this game feels more like it was a prequel that really wanted to have a sequel to expand upon things, but that might just be me. So yeah. The ending is, of course, super predictable and cheesy, which is fine, but like said, the execution and characters seem pretty off here, so I really couldn't enjoy it. Maybe if the plot pacing was better, I would have been okay with it, but the plot got really slow after the common route and just really uninvolving, like I said earlier. There's a lot of things I didn't cover, like Benio meeting her dad and finding out he didn't really uphold to her ideals that she grew to love, which seems really important, but once again, no time is really dedicated to it, and it just feels thrown in there, quite honestly. There's also stuff about the round table that I didn't even mention, but most of that is just completely forgettable, so who cares? Honestly, Nanase should have got a route besides Ayaya, but Nanase is probably would have been too similar to Benio, I guess is what their thought process was. But even then, that's having a route similar to Benio's probably would have still been better than giving us an Ayaya route. That's the thing about this game in a nutshell. I just couldn't bring myself to care about anything that was actually going on in it after a while, even if it had the potential to be interesting. And I suppose Komyu is average at best, maybe? Personally, I didn't even enjoy it that much at all after a while. Also, it's highly unpolished, having 2 routes that don't belong in it, and a 1 route that's incredibly rushed and borderline incomplete, and the other 2 routes, I think are just average at best. The characters are rather flat and don't really develop in interesting ways, or they simply take too long to develop, and the plot, like said before, is almost non-existent for most of the game, and it doesn't really have the atmosphere of other games, so I'm just repeating myself, but it just doesn't really have a lot going for it, other than its portrayal of some philosophies. But even then, that's not enough, Having realistic personality traits, having philosophy, that's not enough to make an engaging story. It really, really isn't. You gotta do a little better than that. You gotta make sure the philosophy complements the story, and not the story being a means for the philosophy, which is really what it seemed like in Komyu's case. So yeah, it's not my cup of tea at all. I don't recommend it. I don't like it. I never want to read it again. And I wanted to drop it early on. I was going to drop it once. I'm just going to go on a tangent on just general thoughts of the game for a little bit. You can stop now. I'm done talking about the game, but I might as well just say whatever runs in my mind at this point. Like I said before, this feels like a really shallow version of Swan Song, quite honestly. It's a shonen version of Swan Song, which is fine, because maybe that's good, because not everyone's going to like Swan Song, because Swan Song's too dark for most people. But it's not, I didn't feel anything from it, and which is a shame. I did enjoy that common route, but the rest of the game is just crap in my... I did enjoy the common route, and I did enjoy Mayuki's route. I really did, in a way, to an extent. But, obviously, I still think most people who enjoy games like Fate Stay Night and Rewrite will probably still like this game. This is actually the second game I've read by this author, and basically most of these problems I talked about, they're the same kind of problems. I just don't think this author's very good at creating drama, he's not very good at creating well-developed characters in my eyes. Maybe that changes depending on his work. Maybe he's gotten better, because usually authors do get better, I hope. But I kind of want to avoid him from now on. I don't think I want to read another work by him. I heard Hello Lady is a lot better than this, but I don't think I want to read that, because both of the works I've read by him were really underwhelming at this point, so I think I'd rather just read something else. So yeah, that's Komyu. If you enjoyed it, great. I could not. I'm happy if you enjoyed it. I'm going to guess most people enjoyed it for its philosophy, the characters, the casual kind of tone the characters give off probably helps that a lot. Some people probably like the comedy more than I do. But to me it's just, at best it's average, but I honestly don't even want to say that. I think even an average game is usually consistently average, but this game I don't even think is consistent in terms of anything. So yeah, it's a lot weaker than Rewrite, if you ask me. In fact, Shizuru's route in Rewrite, which I said was my least favorite route, I'd say Shizuru's route in Rewrite is better than every route in Komyu. I don't know if I'd go as far to say his Fate is better than every route in Komyu, because Fate is an incredibly boring route, so I don't know if I'd say that, quite honestly, but it's certainly no route in Komyu is as good as Unlimited Blade Works or Heaven's Field. But this game was basically a big load of nothing for me, and I wish I went with my initial decision to drop it. Oh well, live and learn.